This episode is brought to you by MeUndies. While MeUndies can't totally help your love life this Valentine's Day, they can offer you insanely comfy undies and loungewear to buy or gift. MeUndies has so many awesome Valentine's Day prints and styles. Plus, you can match with your partner, friends, or even your pets. This Valentine's Day, give the gift that'll keep them thinking of you and score huge site-wide savings at MeUndies.com/Spotify. That's MeUndies.com/Spotify. MeUndies. Comfort from the outside in.
EVO. This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Previously on The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow. The summer of 1984 saw Los Angeles as a city on the rise. The Summer Olympics, the Lakers. Ronald Reagan was president. But behind the glamour, there lurked a growing evil that would have the city at its mercy. A string of murders soon had the city on edge, and a young detective had a hunch that they were connected. Who was this madman terrorizing the city? What did he want? And could he be stopped? In 1924, a massive 700-room luxury property opened in Los Angeles. In what's called the historic core neighborhood of downtown, flanked by Bunker Hill to the north and the Fashion District to the south, this property at 640 South Main Street was a towering testament to an ascending city. It was christened the Hotel Cecil. Built by three men, hoteliers William Tanner, Charles Dix, and Robert Shops, at an astronomical cost for the time of $1.5 million. The Cecil boasted the finest that travelers could expect when they finally arrived in the West. A beautiful marble lobby and alabaster statuary, with stained glass windows in the lobby that filtered the setting desert sun into a kaleidoscope reminiscent of the dreams of stardom that lured so many to California. The Cecil catered to the elite, the rich and famous, and if not for the skyscraper height restriction of 150 feet imposed by city ordinance in 1904, it seemed the Cecil would extend into the clear blue sky forever. But then reality hit. Several similarly sized and outfitted hotels sprung up in the downtown area, and the competition to fill rooms was fierce. Then, just 5 years after opening, America and the world fell off the financial cliff of the Great Depression. The first death at the Cecil was reported in 1931, when a businessman named W.K. Norton took his own life in his room by ingesting poison capsules. Similar events, far too many, would soon follow, until the hotel adopted the terrible nickname, the Suicide. The hotel struggled, but survived throughout the 1940s and 50s as a fashionable spot for the greatest generation enjoying the post-World War II economic boom. But bad luck and worse geography ultimately forbid the Cecil from reaching her potential. You see, besides Bunker Hill and the Fashion District, the historic core is also bordered by a neighborhood called Central City East. But no one calls it that. It's known by a more colorful moniker, Skid Row. By the 1960s, there were thousands of transients living within blocks of the Cecil. The inevitable economic decline of the area worsened, and the Cecil was repurposed into a low-income weekly hotel. And then ultimately, the 700 rooms were rezoned as low-cost public housing. In 1964, a long-term resident of the Cecil, a retired telephone operator named Pigeon Goldie Osgood, was found raped and murdered in her room. That case is still unsolved. In 1991, Austrian serial killer Jack Unterweger was captured after a brief stay at the hotel. Unterweger was a reporter on assignment covering the downtown Los Angeles red light district, but instead, he strangled 3 sex workers to death. And upon his arrest, he hanged himself in his prison cell. More recently, in 2013, the Cecil Hotel was the site of a truly confounding death when Canadian college student Elisa Lam disappeared. Surveillance footage of her erratic behavior in a hotel elevator preceded her disappearance, and later, her naked body would be found in a sealed water tank on the roof of the hotel. It was never determined how she was able to get into the tank, and the investigation couldn't answer the question as to her strange behavior in the elevator. Was she being chased? Was she under the influence of narcotics? Was she suffering a psychotic episode triggered by her diagnosed bipolar disorder? The case remains unsolved.
This is what it looks like at the Cecil Hotel in LA. You can see officials surrounding a water tank. This morning, someone complained about the water pressure at the hotel. When a worker went to investigate, he found the body inside. 21-year-old Elisa Lam went missing on January 31st. She'd been staying at the Cecil. This surveillance video shows the UBC student acting strangely the night she went missing. Once again, the LAPD saying the body has just been recovered.
But going back to the Cecil Hotel of the mid-1980s, we find, much like today, a dangerous environment, rife with drugs, violence, and prostitution. And it was into this cauldron of darkness and vice that we find a 24-year-old drifter from Texas with a penchant for LSD, a newfound addiction to cocaine, and a knack for stealing cars. What he didn't know was that he was also a psychopath who would later be diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy, aggressivity, and hypersexuality. He would soon add to this laundry list of dangerous personality traits: spree killing. During the brutal summer of 1985, this man would call the Cecil Hotel home. His name was Richard Ramirez. Welcome back to The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow. You're listening to Episode 2, Lust. When it comes to the criminal psychosis of Richard Ramirez, it was determined that he was a, quote, made psychopath, as opposed to a born psychopath. The cause or causes that led to this eventuality will be explored in a later episode, but suffice it to say, there was ample evidence, and, if proper treatment were sought, many lives could have been saved. But those diagnoses, a tendency or proclivity for uncontrollable aggression and hypersexuality, are what came to define Ramirez and his crimes, along with a few additional, very important characteristics. But it's the hypersexuality that first drew the attention and concern from investigators. Hypersexuality is a medical condition that causes unwanted or excessive sexual arousal, causing the afflicted to engage in or think about sexual activity to a point of distress or impairment. Before hypersexuality was added to the lexicon, the terms nymphomaniac for women and sex maniac for men were used to describe people with the condition. There is some controversy as to whether hypersexuality should be used as a clinical term by mental health care professionals, as there isn't, as of yet, a consensus in the medical community how best to describe hypersexuality, if it's a symptom of some other condition, or if it is itself a primary condition, or even if it's a separate pathology. There's evidence that it can be brought about as a result of bipolar disorder, dementia, or, in the case of Ramirez, traumatic brain injury. You'll see, as his crime spree expanded, his monstrous sexual violence reached a point of near disbelief, and his grotesque and inhuman treatment of his female victims, when coupled with a growing fascination with Satanism, a fascination that would become an obsession. When combined, the result was nothing short of diabolical. For those few godless minutes, his victims were indeed transported to hell. Beneath the twilight skies of hell's eternal firmament, where the air is heavy with the stench of despair, and the winds howl like the lamentations of the damned, lay the second circle, a realm devoted to the sins of lust. Here, the architecture of perdition unfolded in sweeping vistas, a vast and featureless plain of desolation interrupted only by the ceaseless gyrations of a tempest that paid homage to no god or sun. Its blustery gale, born of unrepentant longing and unfulfilled desire, churned with the relentless fury of souls whose passions had once overruled reason. These violent storms and unrelenting winds symbolize the powerful and uncontrollable nature of carnal desire. This circle of hell serves as a dramatic shift from the relatively peaceful state of limbo, plunging deeper into sin and its consequences. As Dante and his guide Virgil descend into this circle, they are greeted by the infernal judge Minos, a figure from Greek mythology who presides over the damned. Minos' role is to assign souls to their appropriate circle based on the gravity of their sins. He wraps his long, coiling tail around himself a specific number of times, each coil signifying the level of hell to which the soul must be consigned. Minos' grim role underscores the order and justice that govern Dante's hell, where each punishment is precisely calibrated to reflect the nature of sin. Here, Virgil intoned, his voice carrying the gravity of ancient wisdom, here are confined those who surrendered to their carnal appetites, their judgment swayed by fleeting pleasure. Look upon them, Dante, and see the price of unbridled passion. In the second circle, those lustful souls are tossed about by a relentless and chaotic windstorm, symbolic of the way they were swept away of their passions during their earthly lives. The punishment is fitting. Just as their desires were uncontrolled, leading them to act on their impulses without reason or restraint, they are now subjected to the equally unrestrained forces of the storm. The winds, described as strong and howling, ensure that the souls can never find rest or stability, a torment that mirrors their internal lack of control in life. Dante often emphasizes the idea of contrapasso, the principle of punishment fitting the sin. And the eternal whirlwind these souls face reflects their own stormy, uncontrolled passions. Among the souls suffering in this second circle, Dante encounters some of the most famous lovers from both history and literature: Cleopatra, Joan of Arc, and of course the notable pair of Francesca da Rimini and her lover Paolo, who are central figures in this canto. Francesca, a real-life Italian noblewoman, recounts her tragic love story to Dante, explaining how she and Paolo, her husband's brother, succumbed to their mutual attraction while reading the story of Lancelot and Guinevere. Their illicit love affair led to their murder at the hands of Francesca's husband, and now they're forever trapped in the swirling winds of the second circle. "Tell me," Dante implored, his words nearly swallowed by the howling wind, "tell me what sorrow binds you so." Francesca's reply came softly, as though her voice had transcended the storm. "It was not I alone who fell to love's sweet snare, but we together. In life, our hearts conspired against the bonds of law and sanctity. A single moment, a stolen kiss, and we were undone." Her eyes shimmered with spectral tears as she continued, "Now we are eternally caught, condemned to remember the pleasure of that moment while tormented by its consequence. For in the winds of lust there is no rest." Francesca's tale deeply moves Dante, and her romanticized account of love and passion serve to humanize the sinners. However, Dante does not excuse their sin. Though he feels pity, he acknowledges that their lack of self-control led to their damnation. The encounter with Francesca and Paolo also emphasizes the dangerous power of literature and stories to ignite the passions, as it was the reading of a romantic tale that triggered their fall into sin. The second circle of hell, therefore, serves as a commentary on the dangers of allowing desire to rule over reason. Dante portrays lust as a sin that stems from yielding to base instincts rather than adhering to moral or rational principles. The violent windstorm that defines this circle underscores the chaotic and destructive consequences of unchecked passion. In this way, Dante reflects the medieval Christian belief that human desire must be tempered by virtue, and those who fail to do so will face eternal punishment. Ultimately, the second circle of hell encapsulates the theme of the Inferno, that every sin has a consequence, and that even love, when misdirected or ungoverned, can lead to damnation. The ground quaked, signaling the boundary of this circle, and as they reached its farthest edge, Dante cast one last glance into the maelstrom. In that look, he carried not only pity for the souls caught in endless turmoil, but also an unshakable recognition of the universality of human frailty. As they descended to the third circle, the storm of lust faded, but its echoes remained, whispering to Dante and to all who dared remember the wages of passion left unchecked.
This message comes from Greenlight. Ready to start talking to your kids about financial literacy? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app that teaches kids and teens how to earn, save, spend wisely, and invest, with your guardrails in place. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Join millions of parents and kids building healthy financial habits together on Greenlight. Get started risk-free at greenlight.com/Spotify.
Pack your body bags. We're going on a slaycation. Tim, what's a slaycation?
A slaycation is a murder or mysterious death that happens while you're on vacation.
If you like to mix humor with horror and travel,
join me, Kim Davis,
and me, Adam Tex Davis,
and me, Jerry Colbert,
as we look at the craziest slaycations that will have you asking, what the F is wrong with people? You can find Slaycation on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
Just remember, getting away can be murder.
Our Dante in this story, our curious and desperate adventurer thrust into an alien world of suffering and violence, is a young detective named Gil Carrillo. Mentioned briefly in episode 1, let's learn a little bit more about the man who would become the tip of the spear in the hunt for the Night Stalker. The man who we'll be following on his journey into hell.
No one felt the pressure to stop the killings more than Detective Gil Carrillo. He worked day and night to catch the man who will always be remembered as the Night Stalker.
Everything was sexually driven and motivated. Those surviving victims are those that acquiesced to his commands. Those that didn't died.
Gil Carrillo was born in the East Los Angeles city of Pico Rivera in 1952. Gil's formative years of the 50s and early 60s aren't generally thought of as a time of serious Latino gang activity in the greater Los Angeles area. It was still the transplant gangsters from back east that were causing all the trouble. But that wouldn't last. By the time Gil was 17, it was clear that he was headed down the wrong road with the wrong people. He was lucky that a police officer from his neighborhood took enough of an interest to stop at his house and talk with his parents about Gil was getting up to. Before he knew what was going on, he was enlisted in the Army, shipped off to Southeast Asia, and in charge of a combat helicopter crew smack dab in the middle of the Vietnam War. The discipline and respect he found in the Army had a profound effect on the teenager, and he returned from his tour of duty a changed man, with an entirely new outlook on life, himself, and most importantly, on his future. Home from the war and eager to get his life going, Gil had 3 goals: go to college, get back together with the girl who dumped him when he left for the war, and become a cop. By 1971, he had accomplished all three. He'd finished school, married his high school sweetheart Pearl, and was a rookie deputy with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, assigned to his home turf, the East LA station. Deputy Carrillo was among the first to initiate a plainclothes gang unit, as by the late 1970s, the gang problem in East LA had become a serious threat to the community. After a series of outstanding performance evaluations, in March of 1981, while still only in his early 30s, Gil Carrillo was promoted and became the youngest homicide detective in the history of the LA County Sheriff's Department. He was smart, he was driven, fair and focused, with a curious eye and a boundless imagination, exactly the type of man you want protecting your city, and a criminal's worst nightmare. March 27, 1985. Remember, just a week and a half after the Dale Okazaki and Veronica Yu killings. It was early spring, but it felt like the height of summer, as the temperatures were already nearing triple digits. I say March 27th, but that's an educated guess from law enforcement, because the bodies of Vincent Zazzara and his wife Maxine weren't found until the 29th, when an employee became alarmed that Vincent hadn't shown up for a few days to the pizzeria he owned and operated. The pizzeria was a dream of Vincent's. His career had been in investment banking, but after he met his second wife Maxine and decided to buy the Blue House near the 605 freeway in Whittier, another inland city in Los Angeles County, he noticed a pizza place just a few blocks away and made an offer. He bought his home in Whittier in 1977 when he was 56 years old, after his 5 kids had all moved out of his previous home. By 1985, he was a semi-retired 64-year-old small business owner who was happily married to a woman 20 years his junior, and he discovered a new passion besides owning a pizzeria: gardening. And not just potted plants and flower beds, but full-on trees, dozens of them. People tried calling it landscaping, but he insisted it was just gardening. The trees helped with the noise and exhaust from the nearby freeway, and the flower beds smelled nice, added some visual charm, and kept him active and engaged as he settled into this next stage of his life. And Maxine couldn't have been happier. She found the man of her dreams. She was active in her community, involved with several charities, and sang every week in her church choir in Downey. Now, yes, they were unsettled, as anyone would be, when their home was burglarized less than a year earlier in the summer of '84. But they were assured it was a random act and not to be too alarmed. I mean, get a security system, but you don't have to, sell the house. They never got that security system. The drugs had taken hold an hour earlier. And, as they always did, it made him restless. Behind the wheel of his stolen Toyota, the madman left the dreary chaos of Skid Row and melted into the anonymity of the LA freeways. Tonight he would go somewhere familiar, a house he knew, a score he had taken the previous summer that had paid off nicely. A blue house in Whittier, right near the 605 freeway. Vincent Zazzara had fallen asleep on the couch that night. That's where Ramirez would find him when he crept through an open window sometime after 3 a.m. And he wasted no time. One of the manifestations of the myriad mental deficiencies Ramirez was suffering from, including criminal hypersexuality, was the need to neutralize any male figures that could possibly get in his way. He didn't need to see the fear in Vincent's eyes to get aroused by murdering him. He was considered an impediment to a successful evening. Without hesitation, Ramirez shot him once at close range, directly in the temple, killing him instantly. The shot, as you might imagine, woke up the sleeping Maxine, but in her drowsy, confused state, she was no match for a cocaine-fueled lunatic. Ramirez was on her like a wild animal, and in short order had her beaten into submission her hands bound behind her back. She was screaming for her husband, fearing the worst when she received no reply. Meanwhile, Ramirez was demanding to know where they kept their valuables. Apparently, the Zazaras had taken some measures to burglar-proof their home, learning their lesson from the previous summer. Enraged, Ramirez left the room to find what he could, and while out of sight, Maxine was actually able to free herself from her bindings and quickly reached under the bed for the shotgun Vincent kept there, another security addition adopted after the burglary. Maxine raised the weapon just as Ramirez re-entered the room. It was pointed right at him. The shotgun blast would tear him in half. He knew it and braced for the inevitable. It wasn't loaded. The shells would later be found safely tucked away in Vincent's closet. Imagine the abject fear that must have flooded the mind of Maxine Zazara as she was now powerless against a raging murderer who was focused solely on her destruction. The description of Ramirez given 10 days earlier by Maria Hernandez, light-skinned, thin-billed, curly black hair, bulging eyes, with stinking, rotten teeth. This snarling visage was now stood before Maxine, and in his confused rage, she could have killed him, Ramirez immediately raised his weapon and shot her 3 times. She fell back on her bed, dead. The only mercy that night was that Maxine wasn't alive when Ramirez continued his unholy abuse of her. He was so personally offended and terrified that Maxine was able to free herself and procure a weapon that he unleashed a fury not seen in his earlier victims. He went to the kitchen and retrieved a large carving knife, then proceeded to remove Maxine's eyes and place them in a jewelry box that he would keep and that police would never recover. Then, using the same knife, he carved an upside-down cross into Maxine's chest, his first of many satanic symbols he would leave behind. Then, true to his sickness, he attempted to rape the corpse of Maxine Zazara, but still shaken by his own near-death experience, he couldn't perform. Before Ramirez left the Zazara residence, he found whatever valuables he could and left the way he came, through the open window. And it was here that Vincent Zazara would enact some measure of revenge on the man that had invaded his home, the man that had shot him dead, the man that killed and mutilated his beautiful wife. Yes, Vincent Zazara, the gardener, the man who kept immaculate flower beds filled with soft, nutrient soil. Soil that would, that night, perfectly capture and preserve a sneaker print that belonged to the man who had taken so much from him. This sneaker print would be among the most important pieces of evidence that law enforcement would use in the coming months. But for now, Ramirez, unaware of the evidence left in his wake, would simply get back in his car, and within seconds, he was back among the faceless, nameless denizens of the seemingly endless Los Angeles freeway system. If I were to ask you about a popular sneaker company from Oregon, what name would come to mind? Nike, of course. Founded in 1964, it's the largest sneaker company in the universe, and, Jordans. So yeah, Nike is what probably everyone would think about when they think sneakers and Oregon. But for a little while, in the early 1980s, before Nike and Michael Jordan took over the world, there was, and is, another sneaker company from Oregon, founded in 1979 by a man named Jerry Stubblefield. Can you guess what sneakers Hall of Fame NBA players like Scottie Pippen, John Stockton, and Clyde Drexler were wearing in the early 80s? Adidas? No. Reebok? They were all wearing Avias. Maybe you've heard of Avia, maybe not. They were swallowed up by the Nike revolution and never really clawed back a majority of their market share. But after several bankruptcies and acquisitions, they're still around. So why are we suddenly discussing an obscure sneaker brand from the 80s? Because the Night Stalker's sneaker of choice was a pair of Avia 440 men's aerobic sneaker. Black on black, of course. This bit of information was gleaned, obviously, by the shoe print left in the soft soil of Vincent Cesar's flower bed. But as Avia was a popular brand at the time, and the print didn't reveal, the color of the shoe, or obviously the owner of the shoe, though it did reveal the size, men's 11.5, for the moment, this shoe print was simply another piece of evidence for investigators to keep in mind. As Gil Carrillo trained his detective's eye on the gruesome Zazzara crime scene, he had no reason to believe that these murders were in any way connected to the Okazaki and Yu murders from 10 days earlier. Well, except for the fact that a .22 caliber weapon was used. And there was a vicious sexual assault like the Vincow murder. But Detective Carrillo knew that all these descriptors were, unfortunately, very common in the arena of violent crime. Yes, he would note the similarities, and sure, he would ask for a ballistics report, but his hopes weren't very high. It would be 6 weeks before another intruder-style attack would occur, but in those 6 weeks, everything would change. Detective Carrillo had a remarkable capacity to examine, analyze, and most importantly, retain tons of information across a myriad of separate cases that came through the sheriff's department. It was this ability that allowed him, when otherwise unrelated cases flew through his radar screen, to pick up on something that might prove useful.
In the beginning, there weren't a lot of people, especially even cops, that were believing that one person was responsible for all the murders, because there were also some child abductions.
One such case involved a series of child abductions occurring in the cities of inland Los Angeles County, the same turf where Detective Carrillo's so-called Valley Intruder homicides were going down. The abduction all had similar MOs. A girl of 5 or 6 years old, abducted from a public park, would then be sexually assaulted and abandoned in a semi-remote public area. As a homicide detective, these cases were out of Carrillo's purview, but something caught his eye. Although they came from the recollections of traumatized children, the description of their attacker made Carrillo's antenna go up. Skinny, curly hair, stinky bad teeth. Could it be? Out of the gate, not one of Carrillo's superiors would even give the possibility that the Valley Intruder was also abducting and molesting children in his spare time. Wouldn't even give it a second thought. And according to the best thinking at the time, with regard to criminal behavior, they were right. There was no precedent for an offender with such a broad appetite for crimes, age of victims, race, locations, multiple weapons, and method of operation. It would be unique in the annals of the LA County Sheriff's Department.
While sex drove the killer, there was no consistent pattern for authorities to follow. His victims ranged in age from teenagers to seniors. And as for the method of murder,
Knives, guns, ligature strangulation, you name it, he ran the gamut.
Carrillo was the first to suggest they were looking for one suspect, but his hunch was rejected by other detectives.
Nobody in criminal history had ever been documented doing what he was doing, nor have there been any copycats. Nobody's done it since.
But Carrillo trusted his hunch and visited a few of the locations where the little girls were left after their attacker was finished with them. And the hunch paid off. One of the locations just happened to be an active construction site, and the area where the victim was abandoned was directly beside a freshly poured slab of concrete. And wouldn't you know it, there was a footprint perfectly preserved in the concrete as it cured. And not just any footprint. A men's size 11.5 Avia 440 aerobic sneaker footprint. Now, Carrillo had a ballistics match, a corroborated description of his perpetrator, and additional forensic evidence including a fingerprint from the screen at the Vincow residence and 2 shoe prints that tied them all together. He just needed someone to believe him. Someone who'd been down this road before. Someone who knew where the paths might lead and what the pitfalls may be along the way. He needed a guide. Our Dante needed his Virgil to show him the way to hell. Enter legendary Los Angeles homicide detective Frank Salerno. Salerno was only 5 years removed from solving what was up to that point the worst serial killer case in LA history, the Hillside Strangler murders. On the next episode of The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow, after a brief respite, the Valley intruder returns with a vengeance. But little does he know that 2 of the most celebrated detectives in LA history have teamed up to take him down. Plus, we explore the 3rd level of Dante's hell and what was fueling the rage inside the mind of Richard Ramirez. That's next time on The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.